Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday held his annual Year of the End media conference. And according to the tradition, the traditional in-person format has made a return this year after the 2020 event was held virtually due to the pandemic. He focused on domestic issues like the economy and the coronavirus, and also on foreign policy. Russia says it seeks to avoid the conflict with Ukraine and the West. He did hail China-Russia relations. Putin says Russia and China trust each other and contribute to global stability. Moscow will work on deepening ties with Beijing in trade, climate action, space exploration, and more. Let's take a listen.
Как друзья друг другу, и называем друг. Так и есть. У нас личные отношения сложились, очень доверительные.
President Xi and myself, we call each other friends, and we have good personal contact. China's definitely a major powerhouse of the global and regional economy. Naturally, we are developing relations with them, more than 100 billion in bilateral trade, and we support each other in the pandemic. China is our #1 trade partner. We both have commitments to reach interactions in science, education, and culture. That makes us together and brings us closer to one another.
So what's going to be the takeaways from Mr. Putin's annual media conference? Let's ask our panelists in Moscow. Sergei Sanakoev, the president of the Russia-Chinese Analytical Center. Also in Moscow, Dmitry Barbish, a political analyst in Moscow. And in Shanghai, Zhao Long, professor at the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies of Shanghai Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Year-end event usually attract a lot of attention, a great spotlight on Mr. Putin and his personality. What's your general impression? Let's ask our two Russian guests. Mr. Sanakoev, your thoughts, briefly.
So briefly, as it was expected, we could see that Mr. Putin declared very good strategic partnership with China, and his readiness to make a peaceful policy with every neighbors for Russia, and certainly he described his position in the conflict with eastern part of Ukraine, and what his ideas about his negotiations with Joe Biden. So that was the main as for me.
About China, very interesting, Mr. Barbish, your general impression. He described the relationship as trustworthy and constructive.
Well, I think he said something more. He said that the level of relations between Russia and China was unprecedented, and that it was something beyond alliance. We know that there is no formal alliance between Russia and China, but there is a saying in Russia that what we have now between China and Russia is something more than formal alliance. And Mr. Putin said that basically China is now with us on just about all the pressing international issues. Let me remind you that NATO countries, which are now pressuring Russia, which slander Russia, saying that we are going to attack Ukraine, this would be a terrible tragedy that I think will never happen. These are the same countries which are insulting and which are discriminating against China. So that was the clear message that I didn't expect it. I mean, the words that Putin used about China were so warm. I've never heard him saying anything like that about any other country. He was very polite during all this press conference. He said a few good words about traditional allies such as Kazakhstan, such as other former Soviet republics, but on China, Putin was extremely positive, beyond the usual, I would say.
Mr. Zhao from Shanghai, I'm sure you listened with a lot of interest about how President Putin described the China-Russia relations. Mr. Zhao, can you hear me? Apparently, we're having some problems over there. My colleagues will try to adjust. At the same time, Mr. Senakoev, your thoughts about how President Putin described China-Russia relations. You earlier briefly touched on that, but further analysis, please.
Certainly, I agree that he talked about more warm relationship than with any other countries. And please also pay attention how he described his relationship private relationship with Comrade Xi Jinping. He said that we call each other friends, and they are friends. Certainly, they understand the future of humanity, of mankind equally. They understand that this world should have another world order which will be more secured, and it would be multipolar world, not like it is right now. So I agree that we are more than allies right now, and our relationship is absolutely unprecedented.
I see. Mr. Zhao, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, I can.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have noticed that both the speech of President Putin and also the State Councilor Wang Yi recently in Diaoyutai about how China's diplomacy was evolving over the year 2020 and 2021 and likely to do in the year 2022, also mentioned with huge emphasis on Russia. How do you put the both pieces together?
Well, I think, as President Putin mentioned, the mutual trust between China and Russia contributes to the international stability. So this kind of strategic collaborations between us add the stability factors to the period of international turbulence and change. So, for example, I think in the debate about the multilateralism, in a struggle for the politicization of the pandemic and the impact of those actions which broken the non-interference in internal affairs principle. So in that all kind of topics, China and Russia could deliver, I think, more common voices. So also, I think that the relationship between us presents a tremendous resilience. So we are determined to rely on each other strategically and providing the opportunities for each other's development. And I think China and Russia are become each other's global partners. So in terms of all those positive factors, I think there's a great consensus between our leaders, our ministers, about the bright future of our bilateral relations.
But you know, Mr. Zhao, one of the things is very interesting. Given the history, what will be the potential?
Well, the potential, except the strategic coordination, I think there's a huge room for the new growth point. For example, the economic recovery in a post-pandemic era. So as we know, the two sides have already completed the so-called high-quality development roadmap for bilateral trade. So and we are discussing the upgrading the current bilateral investment agreement, in which we are aiming to achieve the goal of $200 billion in trade by 2024. So I think we could expect more diversified pragmatic cooperation, for example, in high-tech cooperation, in agriculture, in financial sectors, and then we could maintain the stability of the in international industrial chain and create more closer energy partnership.
Right.
So that we could continue make such effort in the field such as new technology, big data, and artificial intelligence, and so on.
Right, that is about the long-term potential. The short-term, for example, Mr. Barbish, Russian President Vladimir Putin has already accepted the invitation from the Chinese side to go to the Beijing Winter Olympics, both to cheer for the athletes coming from, originally coming from Russia, and also for as a guest of China. So that in a way, also create a great opportunity for the two to show the camaraderie in a way.
You are absolutely right, and thanks for bringing up the issue of the Olympic Games, because actually most of Mr. Putin's speech about China at this press conference was about the Olympics. President Putin denounced the so-called boycott of the Olympic Games by the United States and Australia. And he quoted a former American president, he didn't say which one, I think it was George Bush the Jr., that former American president told him that the American boycott of the Moscow Olympic in 1980 was a huge mistake. I quote, huge mistake. So President Putin said that now when the United States is trying to establish a political boycott of the winter Beijing Olympics, the United States is making the same mistake it made in 1980. But you know, in Russia, every person who is over 10 years knows that the United States boycotted the Olympic Games in 1980. It was a very, very traumatic experience for Russia, for the former Soviet Union. We remember it very well. So in a way, Putin solidarized with China on this issue, and it's very interesting how he explained it. Putin said that the names of the leaders don't matter, he said. It would happen anyway, whoever would be the leaders of Russia and China. The United States wants to contain the development of China. And then a very important quote from Mr. Putin. He said, it's impossible to contain the development of China. You can adjust yourself to it, you can benefit from it, but you cannot stop it. You cannot contain China.
That's very interesting.
Impossible.
Yeah, the Winter Olympic story, of course, is a very immediate story. Since we talk about the sports and Winter Olympics, if I could quote Nelson Mandela, I've been receiving messages from friends all over the world about the sports and the charm of sports. One of the quote, a friend said, Nelson Mandela once said, "Sport can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than governments in breaking down racial barriers. It laughs in the face of all types of discrimination." Well said. Mr. Mandela always had the ultimate wisdom, since he had been through the ups and downs of human history. After quoting that, let's come back to our discussion about the Winter Olympics and China-Russia. Mr. Senikoev, with that, Russia, of course, was also facing some difficulties in making a national team to the Winter Olympics. Of course, this is a very complicated issue. Now, what does that mean, the participation of the Winter Olympics in Beijing for many athletes originally coming from Russia? Will they be able to demonstrate their utmost performance?
First of all, I think we all remember the visit of Mr. Xi Jinping on Olympic Games in Sochi, 2014. And it was also the beginning of February, and it also was Spring Festival in China the same time. And our receipt of Mr. Xi Jinping was very warm, like very close friend. And I think the same we will see next February in Beijing. I am sure that Putin will be received as a main guest and the most important strategic partner. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Please go ahead.
Okay. So. Certainly, we expect that the Russian-Chinese summit during these Olympic Games will also show to the world that Russia and China are together in understanding of this world, and we will have enough power, political or military power, to force any aggressor in the world to peace. That's the main idea of our Russian-Chinese relationship. And Mr. Putin also mentioned this today in his press conference, that our relationship, Russian-Chinese relationship, is very strong factor for peace in the world.
Let's move on to another issue about Russia. Of course, the issue of Ukraine. Mr. Zhao, how is China looking at the Russia's struggling on the issue of Ukraine with the Western powers?
Well, I think both China and Russia are under the so-called the double containment strategy of the West and especially of the United States. So on the eastern side, we are also struggling with the United States in such issues like South China Sea and Taiwan Strait relations, but also for the Russia, they are struggling, of course, around the Black Sea region. So I think from President Putin's message from today's press conference, I think Russia is committed to reducing and managing current conflict with the West and trying to restore the limited interaction with NATO, whatever, or the United States. Because I think Russia is trying to maintain, of course, its national, to protect its national interest and dignity and also the security. But among them, I think the long-term strategy for President Putin is to push the West to finally lift the sanctions against Russia. He also mentioned that in his the answers. So, and maintain the basic respect for the traditional post-Soviet space of Russia.
I see.
So, and the short-term tactic, I think, is to for Russia is to use the Ukraine issue and border tensions to promote more negotiations, more dialogues with NATO, and to force the US and NATO to return to the negotiating table and have a more equal dialogue with NATO and the United States.
Mr. Sennikov, of course, the president of Russia did not sound very satisfying with the job of the NATO Secretary General. How do you see, he's taking him out in a way rhetorically? And also, how do you see Russia is now working on the relationship with the West, particularly with the United States?
I think if we talking about not only today's press conference but also about the summit, Russian-U.S. summit, so we can see that the most important is the guarantees for Russian security, and this is the main factor in Ukraine. Mr. President today, as it was already told before, mentioned that Ukraine is in the zone of interest of Russia and says about the red lines which shouldn't be crossed. What is this red lines? This is not because we don't like Ukraine choice his way of development. Not. He mentioned that after these 30 years after the Soviet Union crashed, we respect the choice of any states, former Soviet republics, for their choice of development. We respect them, but we cannot sacrifice our interests if OTAN's infrastructure or weapons will be as close as in Ukraine. It's impossible for Russia, and that is the main idea of negotiations with US right now, and that is what we have mentioned in our writing form, giving offers to US how we understand the security and the guarantees of security from West for Russia. And as you know, China also confirmed and China also support these suggestions from Russia to the West.
Mr. Zhao, does China have more empathy now toward Russia and Moscow as a result of the latest China-U.S. situations?
Well, I think there are a lot of common interests for China and Russia to jointly, I would say, resist the pressure from the United States. So you can see that's also the reason that China supports the Russia's idea to have a more negotiation on the security guarantee agreement between West and the Russia. So I think this kind of negotiation could be a future model for China-U.S. dialogues on such issues like in South China Sea and East China Sea. So I think there are a lot of space for China and Russia to cooperate and coordinate with regard to the United States pressure. But as I have mentioned many times, that we are not aiming to forge some kind of joint alliance or anti-West alliance. We are just sharing our joint or common position and policy on the particular topics and in a particular region.
I see. Another direction of questions about Russia today, particularly about the pandemic and the economic situation. Mr. Barbish, inflation has been strong all over the world. However, in Russia, many mention that as a big challenge. How do you see that, and particularly when it's related now to the vaccines, to the pandemic situation?
Well, Putin started his conference with describing the economic situation and the sanitary situation in the country. Russia resumed growth this year. You know, in 2020, Russia lost some of its economic output compared to 2019. That happened to a lot of countries. In that sense, Russia is not an exception. But we have basically 4% growth, according to Mr. Putin, and that's important. On inflation, a lot of people in Russia are criticizing tough monetary policy of the Russian central bank. But Putin defended the Russian central bank, saying that it keeps inflation in check, and that's very important. Because if we don't have such a strong monetary policy, if we don't have a strict central bank headed by a woman, by the way, in Russia, we would go the way of Turkey. Mr. Putin was, of course, referring to Turkey, which saw unprecedented inflation this year. In Russia, since 2015, the currency is pretty stable. There was just a drop in 2015 because of the drop in the oil prices. You know that Russia is still dependent on its oil exports. But since then, I can testify, basically the exchange rate of ruble or compared to dollar is the same. Recently, it started even changing in favor of ruble because so much dollars have been printed in the United States. So in that sense, Putin was pretty upbeat about the economic situation. And I think he also didn't mention the trade turnover with Russia, but with China. But everyone knows that it grew this year and again reached unprecedented heights.
I see.
Precisely in 2021.
All right, Mr. Sennikov, the pandemic situation is still worrisome. The vaccinations, the rate of vaccinations has been not necessarily to the most satisfying level. So with Omicron, which is such a big worrisome factor hanging on the heads of everyone today, how do you see Russia's approach? Did President Putin mention any magic remedy?
So, you know, as for me, I don't think that the pandemic situation in Russia is worse than in any other countries of the world. It's approximately the same situation. As we have already mentioned, the percentage of the vaccination is 55, approximately 55%. And Putin mentioned that it would be better if it will be 80%. So we are waiting for such achievement in the middle of the next year. So I hope that situation will be better now, and more people will understand the all necessity of this vaccination, and we will provide our company better than it was before.
Mr. Zhao, China also helped Russia to produce some of the vaccines that Russia researched on and eventually came up with. How do you see the relationship between China and Russia in terms of pandemic-related areas?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, China is helping Russia in production of its vaccine. I think currently we are discussing very positively on the mutually certification of our own vaccines, and as the very foundation of reopening our borders in the future. So in the next stage, I would say that China can offer some of our own experiences and own practices on the fighting of the pandemic, and how we can use the new technologies, use the big data to correctly recognizing those new added cases, and to help them with the more sufficient quarantine conditions and procedures. So there's a lot of topics that we could further and deepening our cooperation on the pandemic.
Last, very brief question for everyone. Before we go, one sentence from every one of you. I know every one of you is a great talker, but one sentence if you can. How would you sum up Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual press event, particularly relations with China? Mr. Sennikov.
For me, the most important is Russian-Chinese relationship, certainly, and I'm expecting for how our partnership will come to a new era. That is the main important for me.
Mr. Barbish.
I would say Putin was optimistic, hopeful, and sure of himself and of our two countries. In Putin's words, Russia and China will defend themselves, will have great Olympic Games in Beijing, and will help each other.
Mr. Zhao.
Well, I think in President Putin's statement and answers will give us a very solid evidence that our head of state diplomacy is very successful and have more future potential to develop.
Zhao Long, Dmitry Barbish, and Sergei Sennikov. Thank you so much for being with us. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.